The shooting death of conservative influencer Charlie Kirk yesterday has triggered a rare moment of bipartisan unity. The president, politicians, and pundits on both sides of the aisle have condemned the senseless killing and highlighted the kind of open dialogue that Charlie Kirk became famous for bringing to college campuses and to young people. I want to bring in CBS News political analyst Leslie Sanchez, my good friend Leslie, to talk more about this. Leslie, when moments like this happen, and they've happened with alarming frequency over the past couple of years, you know, I'm a student of history. I love history. I always look to history to give me insights into where we are today and where we're going. I was reminded of a quote from Robert F. Kennedy, one of my heroes, who in the wake of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination said this about who we are. He wrote, "In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it is perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. We need in the United States, what we need is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness." He talked about love and wisdom and compassion and feeling, a sense of feeling towards those who still suffer in this country. And I wonder, this was back in 1968. And so as far back as 1968, and even before that, this country was wrestling with our freedom, which is our freedom to have open discourse and open dialogue with people we disagree with acts of political violence. And what I respected about Charlie Kirk is that he was willing to jump into the arena, knowing what he knew about this country's history, to jump into the arena, to go onto college campuses and openly debate with people who disagreed with him. And you knew Charlie. Tell me more about why he was unafraid to do that.
I think more than anything, Charlie believed in breaking apart this calcification, our inability to have discourse. He believed it had been radically, people had been disconnected from the ability to have a conversation with one another. You know, democracy needs public discourse and voices, not fear and not bullets. And if you ask anybody who went on college campuses, it could be a very difficult kind of conversation. There was, protest or people trying to silence these ideas. But he pushed back on that as a Christian activist, as somebody who felt that it was important to open the aperture and have a conversation. And he would debate and like this idea of, the arguments around it. And if he disagreed with you, he would do it respectfully. And he would say, if you won an argument, he'd say, that's something I'm going to really stop and think about. But a very solid man in faith who felt that we had to really open and create a way for us to have these conversations, even if we weren't in alignment, because we are fellow Americans. We are. It's so difficult to talk about it here, and without talking about it in a context of faith. We are each other's brothers and sisters, and we have to find a way to keep that dialogue open, because if dialogue ends, violence begins. And that was also a message that he talked about.
You, before it was confirmed that Charlie Kirk had died, you wrote on Twitter to pray for him and his family and for people to pray for this country. As the news came from the President of the United States that he had been killed, I just thought, of course, of his young wife and his young family. As a father now myself of a 2.5-year-old, I can only imagine how difficult, in fact, I can't imagine how hard it must be for them, and how these children, especially the youngest ones, will only know him as a memory. How did you react when you found out that he had died?
I think, regardless of where you were, there's so many of us, it was gut-wrenching. Our stomachs are turning. I mean, there was so much fear and so much sadness. And today, I think there's just continued amounts of prayer. Prayer not just for this very incredible family, but prayer for this country. Because as you talked about, this political violence, for somebody who's not a politician, for somebody who's a young Christian activist who went on college campuses, he opened 850 chapters among young conservatives who felt they could get engaged again. You hadn't seen a movement like this you'd have to harken back to former President Ronald Reagan and kind of the Reagan revolution of young people getting engaged in politics. And I want to add an important point, Vlad, especially with this younger generation that is digitally native. They grew up entirely in front of screens, if not their parents putting them on before they were old enough to walk. And the one thing you hear from young people is they wanted to see Charlie because they wanted something in real life. They couldn't dissect between the algorithm and what was presented to them that was so hyperbolic and it pushed them one way or the other and you were canceled for believing one thing or the other. They wanted to hear an open dialogue for themselves so they could make a decision. That's where we want this country to be, especially led by this young generation. And Charlie was all about that. And I think that's where we have to be so cautious of where this country's headed when you can't even speak your mind and do it in peace. And the last thing I'd say, it's atrocious to see the comments that have come, after his murder, because this should be a moment where we all talk about political discourse is the bedrock and foundation of our democracy, and that should be sacrosanct no matter where you are.
Could not agree with you more, my friend. And you just said it in your beautiful, eloquent words there. We are brothers and sisters, and that sentiment was echoed by President Lincoln in his first inaugural address. It remains one of my favorite quotes whenever having this kind of conversation with anybody where the President of the United States talked about the fact that we are not enemies, we are friends, and we must not let anything come between us because we are friends, we are not enemies. Leslie Sanchez, my friend, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it.